Hello and welcome to Relatable Code. In this video, we're finally going to write some code. I'm very excited for this step and I hope you are as well because we're going to talk about variables in Kotlin. So let's begin. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to start up the project that we created in the last video. This is it, new project, just click on that. The project should compile and it is. Let's just remove that and remove these. This is the main.kt file and this is it. In the previous video, when we were talking about Gradle, we said that the main entry point of our application was the main kt file. Okay, so the file that we were in, this is where we're going to write the code that we're going to test. Okay, this file currently contains a function called main. A function is basically a block of code that you can execute at your will. And in our case, it's the main function of our application. So let's remove this code. We're not going to need it for now. And let's talk a little bit about variables. Let's suppose you have a library and you want to store some information about your customers. We're going to start this example small and assume that we have only one customer in this library. Okay, in order to store any piece of information about this customer, we need something like a container that can contain some piece of information. So this container is what we call a variable in Kotlin. Let's say that in this library, a customer can only borrow one book at a time. And we want to know which book this customer currently has. In order to do this, we need to create some sort of container that can hold this piece of information. And we can do this in Kotlin in various ways. And one way to do that is by using the var keyword, which stands for variable. And we need to give a name for this variable. Why do we need to do that? In case in the future we want to easily track it and reveal the piece of information that it carries, it needs to have a name. So what is the type of information that we're going to track in this case? It's the borrowed book. So we write borrowed book. But in Kotlin, you can't have two names for one variable, or two words in this case. It needs to be a single word. So let's connect them. And also, a typical way to name variables in Kotlin and many other programming languages is that every single letter of every word in this variable needs to be capitalized, except for the first letter, which is in our case B. So we have two words, we have borrowed and we have book, and we want to capitalize the first letter of the word book. This presentation that you're seeing is called camel case. Okay, it's where you capitalize the first word of every single word in your variable except for the first one. Deal? This is our variable so far, but it doesn't contain the piece of information that we need. In our case, the book that we're going to borrow. Let's say that this customer borrows a math book. So how would we write that? If we try to write math book, this would produce an error. You can see that error by the red underline here and here. Okay, so how do we do this? In our case, this piece of information is two words. When we want to have a value that contains one or more words in Kotlin and any other programming language, we need to use what's called a string. So what we're going to do is we're going to place some quotations at the beginning of this piece of information and quotations at the end. And now what you have is a string. A string is a sequence of characters, you can say, which can mean a word or a complete sentence in English. It doesn't even have to be a complete word, it can just be a single letter. For example, M. This is still a string. Okay, and that's how we create a variable to track the borrowed book of our customer. Let's say that we want to also track the total number of books that were borrowed by this customer. Maybe in the future we want to know which customers we want to give discounts for. So how we do that, we create another variable also using the var keyword. And what do we want to track in this case? The total number of books borrowed. And what we agreed on in Kotlin, the variable names should be a single word. So let's make this a single word by removing the white spaces. And also we need to make this into a camel case. How we do that? We look at the word, we leave the first letter as it is, and we start with the other words. Our other word here is number, we capitalize the N. Then we have of, we capitalize the O. We have book, we capitalize the B. And we have borrowed, we also capitalize the B in this case. And now we have camel case. Deal? So the total number of books borrowed in this case should be a whole number, which means it shouldn't contain any decimal places. Let's say that this is 5, a total of 5 books borrowed by this customer. This type of variable is called an integer. An integer is just a whole number that doesn't contain any decimal places. Okay? Let's say that if the customer returns this book at a late time, he has to pay some fees to the library. Let's try to present this in a variable as well. So we go ahead and create another var, and let's call this fees. Okay, and let's say that these fees are not whole numbers. They can be something like, for example, $4.5. What is the variable type in this case? It's called a double. A double is basically a number that holds some decimal places. And now we want to know whether or not this customer has any books that are overdue. How do we do this? We basically create a variable, and in our case, this variable can only contain 2 values. This customer can either have books that are overdue or he doesn't. Okay, in this case, we need a variable that can only contain 2 values. So let's name it something like has overdue books. And in our case, we need something called a boolean. A boolean is basically a variable that has 2 values. It can either be true or false. In our case, let's say that this customer has some overdue books. So we go ahead and write has overdue books equal true. And that's how we create a boolean. So to recap, a string is basically any piece of information that needs characters to be represented. And as we've discussed, it doesn't have to be a sequence of characters. It can be a single character, and it can even be an empty string in this case. What matters the most is that you have these 2 quotations at the end and at the start of the string. Deal? And one tip you can use, if you hover over the borrowed book variable, its name, you can see here var borrowed book of type string. That could help you out when you are reviewing this lesson. Another type of variable that we discussed is the integer. An integer is basically a whole number that doesn't contain any decimal places. In our case, the total number of books borrowed by this user. Another type of variable we discussed is the double variable. It's basically a number containing decimal places. In our case, the fees that the customer has to pay to the library in case he or she has any books that are overdue for return. The last type of variable we talked about is the Boolean variable. This is basically a piece of information that can only have 2 values. It can either be true or false. In our case, this variable was whether or not this customer has any books that are overdue. In this case, it would be easy for the library to determine that type of information. Maybe the library will then proceed to call the customer and tell him or her that they have some books that are overdue and that they have like maybe 2 or 3 days to return that book. Deal? If you found this information relatable, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for future content, and I'll see you in the next video.